Hello, everyone. I am Catherine of Catherine's Corner. Thanks so much for joining me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am with the one and only Bob Sutton today, and you've heard his name if you know anything about assholes at work. He wrote the New York Times best-selling book, The No Asshole Rule. Still a hot book, I would assume.
It's still selling. We just renewed the Russian rights, which sort of seems like appropriate,
Yeah, that's pretty funny. Can we send one to certain leaders?
Yeah. Certain leaders are mentioned already in some of the books.
So just to introduce you further, you are at Stanford. You study leadership, innovation, organizational change, workplace dynamics. You've published a zillion of articles, and your recent book is called The Friction Project.
Right.
How leaders make the right things easier and the wrong things harder. So I need to pick up a copy of that book. Tell us a little bit about that book.
So this book, this is the book, The Friction Project. The reason Huggy Rao and I got interested in this, and it may say something about my particular pathology, but I tend to write books about things I'm pissed off about. The No Asshole Rule would be an example.
Okay.
But this book, so there were all these organizations we knew. Like I actually worked some with Facebook when they had a couple hundred people. And then they grow like crazy. And then that happened with Google and Stanford, certainly, Mother Stanford. It just keeps having more and more administrators. And what happens is things get harder and harder to get done as organizations get larger and complex. So while everybody in Silicon Valley says they want to scale, baby, scale, they look at what they end up with and they say, how the hell did this happen? I'm moving in this like bureaucratic hell. So anyway, Huggy Rao and I, we spent maybe 7 or 8 years trying to figure out, why this happens and what you can do about it.
Okay.
And the upshot of all of it was that we actually over time got more optimistic that it wasn't all over. You could do something to fix it.
Okay.
I mean, companies like Microsoft, and they have some issues, but Walmart have actually gotten better about removing friction. Walmart's actually very impressive in terms of how they deal with it. And then there's good friction and there's bad friction. I guess the best way there's one story that might summarize the whole book. At Google, what happened was they had a crazy bureaucratic rule that made sense in the beginning.
Okay.
They would do as many as 25 interviews before doing a hiring decision. They wanted people who were good technically and good culturally, which might have made sense for the first couple hundred people. But when they had 50,000 people, it didn't make sense anymore. They were still doing it. So Laszlo Bock, who was then head of HR, he put in a simple rule. So this is good friction, that if you are going to hire more or do more than 4 job interviews, you need written permission from me. And I still have contact with Google, and although Laszlo's gone, they still have the discipline and rarely do, except for maybe really senior, really complicated positions, more than 5 interviews. So I like that story because it's a bad friction story that's sort of, something that was made sense in the culture. And just imagine,
that's crazy.
Just imagine, scheduling 25 interviews, just insane. Laszlo had 25 interviews when they decided whether or not to hire him. So to me, in some ways, there's lots of nuances in a long book, but that story in some ways summarizes that some friction's good and some friction's bad. And you can use good friction to get rid of bad friction.
I love that. And I mean, that definitely shows up in our work too. Core values is probably another great example, as you know, where they've had the core values forever, but they don't use them. And you hired a company called Civility Partners. There's no room for being an asshole in your core values, I would assume. Why do you need us? Well, you haven't been living your core values. But the thought of changing them is like, it's like, why do you care? Let's refresh them. And core values aren't meant to be standalone for hundreds of years. That's not
it. Yeah. So that's what got you there, won't get you there. But also in your story, since we both sort of work in what I would call the asshole space and you would call the civility space. Here's Catherine's book.
Oh my gosh.
Buy her book. It's excellent. I just read most of it today. So, but one of the things that I'm sure you've had this, that in terms of the no asshole rule, and this used to happen to me about once a year, that some big company would contact me and say they wanted to post the no asshole rule, and
Yeah.
they would use the rule, and they'd still be assholes.
Yeah.
They just would have the rule. So I would say to them, I remember one large pharmaceutical company, you don't want to do that because you will be hypocrites and assholes.
Yeah.
That's even worse.
Yep.
Right. So it sounds like you're doing the same thing. So
yeah, and we still now, not so much anymore, but can you do training for our company? Well, what's driving your request? Well, we have an asshole, and we're hoping they'll pick it up and take some tips, you know. And I'm like, just to be clear, you are going to waste 200 people's time because of one person. Could I just coach that person? Wouldn't like, oh no, we are too afraid of, you know, poking at them or holding them people. And it's just like, I'm not doing that. And then we'll all look like assholes. And
that also, you know, I'm sort of like you know, I sort of like been feeding at the trough, and I'm sort of like overwhelmed with the ideas in your book. There's so many good ideas. But one of the, it's really, I can't believe how much stuff you got in that book. It's remarkable. But one thing that you're sort of aiming at, like if I like think of like what's the diagnostic questions I look for, and it sounds like we're in agreement here, is I want to know what they do when they have a star lawyer. My wife used to run a big law firm. It's not an accident I wrote the no asshole rule when she was leading a large law firm. This is like not a surprise. She was managing partner, and they had like about 1,000 lawyers. Yeah. Doctors, academics, we got plenty of assholes in academia. The question is, when somebody is a star and a jerk, what did they do about them? And to your point, if they move around them, they let them, the rules don't apply to that person. It's like and I'll actually I'll name names, since I wasn't. So 15 years ago, I needed heart surgery.
Okay.
And so I was trying to make the decision between Cleveland Clinic, which is 2,000 miles from my house, and the Stanford heart surgery folks, which is about 1.5 miles from my house. And I went to Cleveland. I had a lot of time because I had like a heart valve was getting worse and worse, but very slowly. And in Cleveland, they would fire superstar surgeons who were assholes. And I won't name him, but the heart surgeon that I met at Stanford, although more famous than mine at Cleveland, was clearly an asshole. Yep. And in fact, while I was waiting, of course, he kept me waiting for 2 hours. His assistant at the front desk told me he was an asshole because she figured out I'd written the no asshole rule, and said I actually wrote him a 10-page letter last week about all the ways he's an asshole. He has to change his behavior. And my surgeon I will name, Mark Gillenoff at the Cleveland Clinic, is the most lovely person. And culturally, since you're into culture, and I just reading your book, like the culture stuff's really important. The way that Stanford at least was organized, that in heart surgery would be the superstar surgeon, and everybody would be afraid of that person, and their team would sort of come and go. At Cleveland, they have a dedicated team that works 24 hours around the clock, who are, in this case, Mark Gillenoff's team. It's like 6 or 7 people, nurses, physician's assistants, and so forth. And they look after their patients and make sure that all the handoffs work. So they not only didn't have assholes, in fact, they bought the no asshole rules. Toby Cosgrove bought the no asshole rule for the, he was the head of the Cleveland Clinic for the heart surgeons, but they also had a team-based system so the handoffs would work. And you know how important handoffs are in healthcare.
Yes. And then you wonder too, you think about all of the fear that people have, and they, when they're afraid of their boss or the surgeon, and then they see one wrong move, but they don't say anything because they're afraid. And, that could be patient health or very damaging results. And that's a very serious scenario versus the office where there's an asshole, but it's literally life or death.
Well, so I was in your book. I was reading about psychological safety just about 20 minutes ago, and one of the things, and this is just in terms of the kind of culture that you and I hope organizations will develop. So Amy Edmondson, who's the mother of the whole psychological safety movement, she's been studying this stuff for 30 years. Her husband's a doctor. Her husband's actually dean of the Harvard Medical School. So she's George. But her dissertation was basically, and other research is basically on the notion that what do you want if you're in a place where mistakes get called out where nurses are noisy error makers and call out other people's errors, that's the kind of place you want to be. It's less likely to kill you. And when there's fear, that doesn't happen.
Right.
So anyhow, so that's something I think that your work really reminded me of.
Thank you. I'm curious. I have my ideas, but I want to hear yours. Who's the fixer of culture? You hear culture comes from the top all the time, and I don't know that I agree with that. Certainly, the top decides that they want to put resources towards it or not. But I'm curious about your take. Does culture come from the top?
Well, it helps when it comes from the top.
Yes.
But I think this, the most amazing thing. So there are organizations that I sort of think of that had culture fix or led by great people. So just two that come to mind. One person I know pretty well, the other person I don't know at all. But Ed Catmull, who built Pixar, and he wrote what I think is the best business book ever written, which is Creativity Incorporated. I'm biased, but I think it's the best one ever written. And he created a culture where it was safe to argue, or his team base was safe to make a mistake. And that's an example of somebody, or Satya Nadella, who really, we're just talking about, changed the definition of a star at Microsoft. It used to be the way you were a star is you stabbed everybody in the back most effectively.
Yeah.
And he talks about this explicitly in his book. And now the definition of a star is, well, not only somebody who does great work, but somebody who helps the people around them succeed. Yes. And their whole HR system is all changed around that. But there are some organizations I know of, and you probably know about these too, where it actually has a healthy culture despite the fact they have a dysfunctional CEO.
Yes.
And this is when they're I was talking to my friend, Beth Steinberg. Beth Steinberg is, she's been head of HR or senior in HR every company from Nordstrom's, Nike, Facebook in the early days, Chime. Now she's doing, she's like it's amazing. And the way she describes it is that in some organizations she's been part of, I better not name the exact ones. She said, so there's a couple of us who do the cleanup on aisle 5 job, which is that we're really skilled at protecting the culture and the rest of the organization from the idiot who's the CEO, who happens to have the investors in the market charmed.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes that cultures are great despite rather than because of the CEO.
Yes, I would agree. And that's the thing too, is like engagement surveys, kind of bringing it to the lower levels. I know that you can be engaged and be in a toxic work environment in the same way.
Yes.
Where you're like excited about work and your team, but the boss is an asshole, or there's a lot of other things going on around you that are toxic, but you can still be engaged. So that's something I always talk about, that, if you're doing an engagement survey, great, but don't assume that means you have a good culture.
Right.
It's not looking at your culture. It's
I think Facebook has some of that, actually, because a lot of people are very excited to work at now Meta. But Mark Zuckerberg is not exactly an untoxic person. So, but I still know people who love working there. So that's a classic sort of example of that.
Well, actually, that's another good question. So I'm curious. It's Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg. There's a lot of evidence that to run a giant company like that, you have to be an asshole, because that's Steve. Is that true?
Well, so I don't think there is evidence. I will still argue it happens despite rather than because of them. And let me dissect that a little. First of all, my perspective, and maybe you have a different degree, is that if you are a winner and an asshole, you're still a loser, because we both know this. It's all over your book. The amount of damage you're leaving behind you is amazing. You are not an effective, successful human being in my book. I don't care how much money you have and so forth. Okay, so. But then let's sort of, and some example of this is if Reed Hastings, who built and still leads the modern Netflix. I know multiple former heads of HR and other folks who've worked for him, and everybody says that Reed is actually a nice, reasonable guy who wants you to, and he gets upset if you don't give him negative feedback about what's wrong.
Okay.
So it is possible. And then now let's talk about Steve Jobs in particular. Okay, so in the no asshole rule, I had a chapter on the virtues of assholes, which starred Steve Jobs, of course. So this is 2007.
Yeah, it's been a while since I read it.
No. But then, so I got to know the aforementioned Ed Catmull, and Ed started arguing with me. And Ed said, Ed's argument was that the Steve Jobs who got fired by Apple and who failed at Next and was sort of sent into the wilderness, that person was the asshole. But after going through the pain of that, and remember, Ed would see him every week or so, because Steve owned Pixar before he sold it to Disney. Right. And Ed's argument is that over time, Steve became a more and more civilized human being.
Okay.
And so it's oversimplified to call him an asshole. Now, I also will give you a little proviso that the Pixar culture was built by Ed Catmull and a guy named Alvy Ray Smith. And when Steve would go to Pixar, he would act like they did at Pixar, and shows you how powerful culture is. Steve Jobs, asshole. He gets there and he'd be civilized. But then I talked to, and I won't name him, but I just had dinner with a friend of mine who was on Steve's top management team. And he said, they got the nice Steve Jobs. We got the asshole. And this is somebody who's rich enough because of Steve Jobs. He owns 4 houses.
Okay.
But he still says that, and to me, that shows you the power of organizational culture. So Steve owned Pixar and was the CEO of Apple.
Yeah.
And he was a nicer person at Pixar because that was the culture.
Okay.
That story. So that story really always just, because situations are powerful. That if the game is you win here by being an asshole, then you act like an asshole. But Steve realized it was Ed Catmull's culture. So
yeah, it wasn't going to work. And that's something I'm telling employees a lot in training, is that there's power in numbers. Create the peer pressure to be civil. In fact, I have a funny slide of like bullying, and it says, "Be civil, damn it." If everybody starts kind of calling out the bad behavior or standing up for themselves, then you can evolve the culture. But unfortunately, employees sometimes are just so afraid, and of course, that's because of the culture,
right?
And it's hard for them to really get that they can influence it if they work together and do, that eventually that behavior can be stomped out.
So that's another thing that, again, just I'm fresh from reading your book all day. Your book and the power failure are the main things and I did in a bike ride today. That's been my day. But one thing that's really clear that I think we both agree on is that both to build a culture and the sign of a, if you will, a no asshole or a civilized culture, to use more civilized language, that when something is wrong, it gets nipped in the bud.
Right.
Yeah. And to me, I'm thinking of the best leaders, because I've had so many bad and so many good academic leaders.
Yeah.
So one thing I talk about in the Asshole Survival Guide towards the end is I had a department chair named Peter Glynn, really civilized Canadian. And I think I'm generally nice to my students, but I got pissed off and wrote a nasty email to a student who was driving me crazy.
Okay.
And my department chair made me apologize to him in writing and in person. and he was right. At least this fits my view that there's temporary and certified assholes, and we're all capable of being assholes under the wrong conditions.
For sure.
Maybe that's just offensive.
Except for you and I, of course.
I definitely can be an asshole under the wrong conditions. I think we're all capable of it.
Yes. 100%.
That's my excuse.
100%. All right. So I have one last, final, most important question. What's your favorite part about my book?
So, well, first of all, there's so much, but which I was just actually looking, the one I really like, which is really important, is that being civilized or not being an asshole does not mean you're a doormat. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the one that really struck me, it's on page 9. There's so much stuff here I could flip. But the idea of the difference between tough and toxic behaviors, that just because, skilled leaders, like they have the radical candor things, they give people negative feedback. They will fire people who are incompetent or are jerks or both.
Yep.
So and and just think of my friend Patty McCord at who was the head of HR at Netflix for the first 14 years. It's like no assholes, no bozos.
Yeah.
And we will fire you if you're incompetent or just not great, actually.
Yeah.
Or if you're a jerk. And so that, see, here's even the page.
Oh.
So I've got it right here.
Thank you. I do get that question a lot. So I'm happy to, Leela says, I'm going to order it, but not from Amazon. Okay, then.
A sale's a sale, Catherine. You know it.
Well, thank you again, Bob. And just to circle back to the past, I wrote my first book, Back Off, in 2009, and you wrote a little testimonial for it. And I really appreciated it back then. I really appreciate you now. And the For Dummies book is like version 2 of Back Off with the 16 years of experience I've added on.
I mean, so the thing about your book, that this book, which I've spent most of the day reading in between trying to figure out when my power is going to come back, the thing about your book is the degree to which, if you are a manager or an employee, that you actually give people instructions about what to do.
Yep.
So the idea about the little things, since life is all little things that adds up to big things, I think your book is brilliant on that. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, we'll see everyone in the bookstore purchasing my book. Thank you again, Bob.
Thank you, Catherine. It was fun. Bye-bye.
Bye.